have a virtual seat, and we will get started promptly at 6 o'clock, which is right now, according to my watch here. So, hi, hi, hi. Thank you for joining us. And the first thing I want to do is to ask you to tell us where you're joining us from. We like to know what our reach is and the extent to which Project Humanities has moved beyond our sort of local Arizona and even local Tempe area. So please tell us where you're joining us from. And I want to officially welcome you, but also to thank you for joining us here in Arizona this evening. But I know that people are joining us from all over the place. This is a special day. In that we do this annually, a conversation about Dr. King, but Project Humanities has tried to move beyond these sort of everyday conversations to sort of move into places where we are educating ourselves about Dr. King's life and legacy. But before we get into sort of the business and the official conversation, I want us to acknowledge, next slide, please, that Project Humanities is indeed situated on ancestral lands of Indigenous people, past, present, and future. We are taking every opportunity we can to thank and honor the Native American tribes and sovereign nations of the Salt River Valley, including the Akimel O'odham, the Ankh-Akimel and O'odham and Peepash nations, whose stewardship of the land and waterways allows us to be here, at least in Arizona and Tempe at Arizona State University now. And in addition, we are trying to do our best to honor those continued and many contributions today. For those who don't know who Project Humanities is, next slide, please. Project Humanities brings people together and has for the past 12 years, communities, individuals to talk, listen, and connect. And that may be profoundly simple to some folks, but we see it as core to issues of justice and humanity. And framing what Project Humanities does relative to diversity and justice is appropriately something that binds our programs together, binds our values and our mission. Dr. King has said, large segments of society. Now, at the time, he talked about white society, but I want to contextualize this much larger because we do think of things intersectionally. People who are committed to the status quo and tranquility. And that is not what Dr. King did, and that is not what we are doing. We are about disrupting the status quo in the name of justice and humanity. And we challenge you now, and we'll remind you at the end of the program to commit yourself to living these principles that we call Humanity 101: compassion, empathy, forgiveness, integrity, kindness, respect, and self-reflection. These are not faith-based, but rather faith in our humanity. So thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us. And let's start this conversation. Let me introduce the folks who will be facilitating with me this conversation. It is not a lecture. It is not a keynote, but rather a conversation. And I'm going to ask them to give about a 30-second introduction of what you want us to know about you. And then we will launch into a conversation about why we are having a conversation about Dr. King and economic justice. So I'll start with you, Ray. Would you introduce yourself to our virtual audience?
Hi, yes, my name is Ray. I am a coordinator at Project Humanities right now, but in the past, I was a organizer with the Texas State Employees Union. So I organized over 1,000 employees in the South Texas region, from all different types of state departments. Um, and so before that, in order to get that job, I was also involved in a lot of grassroots organizing in Phoenix, in the Phoenix metro area. When I was a student at ASU, I was on the board of the United Students Against Sweatshops for 4 years in my undergrad. When I went to ASU, I was involved in numerous different organizations such as Lucha, ACE, which is Lucha is a part of, and then also organizing with Unite Here for different types of struggles in Tempe and Phoenix. And so, yeah, so that's what I bring to the table is my experience as someone who's done economic justice organizing as well as grassroots organizing.
Thank you, Ray. Dr. McKinney, give us a 30-second thumbnail of who Dr. McKinney is.
Good evening. Hope everybody is well. Thanks again for the invitation. I'm Charles McKinney. I'm an associate professor of history and director of Africana Studies at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm coming to you all live from my house because we got 5 inches of snow last night. So, so that's also very significant, very relevant. I am a scholar of the civil rights movement. I've been profoundly fascinated over the course of the last 20 years about the process of building and sustaining movements for liberation. And so Martin King is a guiding star, a guiding light, politically, socially, morally, culturally, intellectually, religiously, in all manner of ways. So I'm always very happy to talk about Brother King. Very happy to be here.
Well, and this is our second time together. So we are building on programs and principles that we've established in Project Humanities. Christine, you can take the slide down. And let me introduce myself for those who don't know. My name is Neil Lester. I'm a professor of English here at Arizona State University, have been here for a very long time. And I teach African American literature and culture and have always integrated, sometimes not knowingly, these principles of justice in my teaching of African American literature and culture. So thank you again for being here and for joining us. I want to engage our audience and our co-panelist in a response to this quote by Glenn Beck. And I know somebody's going to say, why are we talking about MLK and Glenn Beck? Glenn Beck, as some of you may know, is a U.S. conservative political commentator, radio host, and entrepreneur, and has some very interesting things to say. Here's the quote here. He says, I beg you, look for the words social justice or economic justice on your church website. If you find it, run as fast as you can. Social justice and economic justice, they are code words. I'm going to read that again, and I want you to just give me your initial response to that. I beg you, look for the words social justice and economic justice on your church website. If you find it, run as fast as you can. Social justice and economic justice, they are code words. Let's see what your responses to that quote are. We'll let our people in the chat respond, and then I want to start with two of our co-facilitators here. If you see those words, run as fast as you can. Any responses? In what context? All right. Let's see. Okay, that's your response. Let's see another response. Dr. McKinney or Ray, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think, okay, yeah, Dr. McKinney.
No, please,
first.
Ray, go ahead.
Oh, it's just really interesting because as someone who was raised Catholic, we talked about social justice a lot, and actually we were raised to talk about economic justice, but it was kind of like a light version of kind of what is actually called for to actually take action. So when we were talking about these things, such as learning about poverty and helping, those who are less fortunate economically, it always kind of was in the context of, oh, now we need to go do a mission trip along the border of Mexico, or now we need to do a mission trip in, like, I don't know, some other country, and then help those people. So it's kind of doing that othering and kind of bringing in that conversation of poverty porn again. So I don't know, it's kind of conflicting because it was good principles that were instilled in me and kind of, inspired me later in life. But at the same time, it wasn't the kind of work that would actually enact change politically. So that's kind of my reading of it initially.
All right. Dr. McKinney.
So I was going to say that just sort of tracks, right? In terms of the opposition that he is articulating to economic justice and social justice, that is a very old argument, right? So Beck is not, he's not breaking any new ground here in terms of the critique that he is trying to unfurl, right? They're code words. They're code words for what?
That's
guessing what Glenn, guessing based on Beck's politics, right? he's probably going to say they're code words for, for Marxist ideology, right? They're code words for Marxism or communism or yada, 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 right? So, and that tracks in terms of that was the critique levied against Martin Luther King Jr. In the 1950s and 1960s. Martin King is a communist. Martin King is a Marxist. Martin King does not embody or symbolize American values because he's going around talking about, these dirty words like integration and equality and, justice, so on and so forth, right? So yeah, that quote from Beck, that tracks.
Well, and it's interesting also that that the fact that he says specifically on a church website, which Ray sort of commented on, is this whole notion that somehow, if you are a believer, then you sort of know that Jesus was pretty radical also. And this notion of Dr. King sort of being too radical, for Christianity doesn't quite make sense to me. I want to know though, and this is how we met and worked together back in 2021 when we talked about the King. I think the title was "The King We Don't Know," and it was done in 2021. And you had spoken on an NPR interview that I had listened to, and you said something about we as and Americans or non-Americans in the across the particularly in the U.S. want to paint Dr. King sort of romanticized as a Black Santa Claus of love and nonviolence. So I want to start with this first question about what is there that causes such angst and even ignorance when it comes to Dr. King as a real radical? Why is the Dr. King, the sugar-coated Black Santa Claus King, more digestible for so many? And for whom is that sugar-coated version of MLK more digestible and offensively reductive? That's the question I'm asking the audience, and I'm asking Ray and Dr. McKinney. Why is there such ignorance and angst about the radical Dr. King?
Well, I think there's always there tends always to be angst about the radicals, right? In a society that prides itself on moderation and middle of the road policies and politics, and that prides itself on the idea, right, the myth of political and economic models that ultimately benefit everybody. When people who come along and say, hey, these paradigms that we've constructed in terms of the paradigms we've constructed around our economic model, our social and cultural and political models, so on and so forth, those paradigms don't work, right? They're broken. They're not designed to work for everybody, right? So when you come along and you say that, right, when you come along and say, when you pull out the wizard behind the curtain, that's just not going to make you very popular, right? And so during King's life, it's really easy for us to forget that at the time of his assassination, he was one of the most disregarded, disrespected people in the country, right? We think we have this holiday now as if 1967 and 1968, he was at the pinnacle of his popularity. He was at the nadir of his popularity, right? He was very, very unpopular, across wide swaths of the population. He was unpopular amongst white folks. He was unpopular amongst the critical mass of Black people, right? The critical mass of people of color, right? Because they thought he had gotten too radical, because they thought he had strayed away from a comfortable version of politics, a version that people sort of felt like they could access, right? If we were nicer to each other, if we are kinder to each other, if we arrest people who blow up Black churches, right? If we let Black people vote, then we've won, then we've succeeded, right? So, and then you add 50 years after his assassination, the country goes into overdrive in terms of moving us away from this critique of American power, moving us away from what he had to say about economics, what he had to say about militarism and racism and poverty, moving us away from that. And what are we left with? nonviolence,
Right.
that
And
love,
the
turning the other cheek. The
right.
second half of the "I Have a Dream" speech, right? Not
Right.
the first half,
Not the first
where
half.
he talks about, look, we're in the streets and we're going to stay in the streets until we get what we want. Not that half,
Right.
right? Not the half where he's talking about police brutality. Not
Right.
that part,
Right.
right? But the dream part, right? So, so yeah, so there's an investment in recreating, recasting King as a Black Santa Claus,
Right.
because everybody loves Santa,
Right.
and Santa is harmless. So so again, it's a really effective way for us to move away from what King was actually trying to say and what he was actually trying to do.
Ray, you made a comment before we started saying that there had been a post of one of our former staff members about how this was a deliberate effort to create this sort of mythical king. Because you want to share that with our audience?
Yeah, so it was really interesting, and I'm pretty sure Dr. McKinney can probably elaborate on this, but it was a quote talking about, as we remember Dr. King in 2024, and, in light of what's happening in the world, there's a lot more strikes that I think people are becoming aware of, and boycotts, and people using their economic power in order to make change in the world. I think it's becoming a really popular idea, or at least we're seeing it more in the news. And so I think that was kind of like the theme of what this post was, and trying to remember Dr. King's image and the way that he fought for other things on top of civil rights. And so it was a juxtaposition between what Ronald Reagan's stance on it was. So Ronald Reagan was strongly opposed to the civil rights movement, and then he shifted it. And so I guess he was the president when Dr. King the holiday was being proposed, but he had explained in a letter to the New Hampshire Governor Meldrum Thompson that the holiday would be based on an image of King and not the reality. So I'm not sure if Dr. McKinney is familiar with that and wants to elaborate on that, but I thought that was really interesting. It's one of those informational posts, so it doesn't have all the quotes and everything to it, but I thought it was like something that's food for thought, because we're questioning, why are people not talking about Dr. King's, what he really believed in and what he was trying to do and create radical change. Instead, we're kind of pacifying that.
Well, and the fact that you mentioned this very tailored image, it sort of reminds me of all the stuff that I have in my office, and people have been there, that once emancipation, and I use that in air quotes, was granted and people were free. He even talks about free to be poor, free to be living in quote unquote slums, free to do this, but nothing about resources and opportunity. It's sort of like holding on to this illusion of what you want to be versus what is. So when we're talking about Dr. King and we're talking about what makes it radical, let's hone in very specifically on what exactly are we talking about when we talk about economic justice. What's encompassed in that big umbrella of economic justice, which is painted everywhere in Dr. King's speeches? In fact, I'm hard pressed to find some place where he doesn't allude to some form of economic justice in the same breath as he's talking about racism and militarism. So what are we talking about when we talk about economic justice, specifically and more broadly?
Well, I think one of the things that's important for us to always do when we're talking about King is we have to place him in his context.
Okay.
Right. One of the ways that we turn him into a Black Santa Claus is we have him floating above and sort of partially removed from the circumstances of his time. Right. So we know that he has something to say about segregation, but we're not sure what that is. We know he has something to say about inequality, but we're not quite sure what that is. We know he was nonviolent and that he wanted everybody to love each other. And that's all we get. Right. So when we place him in his time, when we place him in his context, we understand that one of the things he's battling against is legal segregation. Right. And legal segregation at its core, right, you can argue, and I would argue, right, is an economic project. Right? Legal segregation is a way to perpetuate and to perpetuate the echoes of slavery. Right? It's a way to keep Black folk chained to the land. right? Access to education is severely barred for African Americans in the American South. Vast majority of Black people still living in the American South in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. That's shifting and changing, but they're still there, right? And the folks who are there are still tied to the land in some profound ways, picking cotton, right, tobacco, and so on and so forth. So the opportunities that we take for granted, all of the infrastructure of the American dream, all of the things that you're supposed to be able to do, work hard, play by the rules, get it, advance at your job based on your abilities. All of this stuff is not available to Black people, right? If you live in Alabama in the 1950s, you can't go to the public institutions, right? The majority white public institutions. You're barred. It's against the law, right? Black women are the top employment category for Black women in 1970 was still domestic labor, right? What does that mean? It means Black women were essentially and effectively barred from all manner of opportunities with regard to enhanced economic opportunities, enhanced economic possibilities. So segregation is very much a function of economic exploitation, economic domination. So it should not come as a surprise to us that Martin King has a lot to say about economic justice and economic equality, because again, that's one of the major components of segregation, one of the major components of racial subordination. 1963, the March on Washington. The whole title of that thing is the March on Washington for what? Jobs and freedom, right? Jobs and freedom, right? The guy who's one of the major architects is hoped to put this together. A. Philip Randolph, right? Labor union leader, a union man, right? Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and so on and so forth, right? So when we take King seriously and when we place him in his time, and when we actually read the words that he wrote, and listen to the words coming out of his mouth, which is something that we rarely do these days. It's right there in plain sight. It's right there in English for all of us to read, right? For all of us to see and understand that these are the things that we have to grapple with.
Well, and this notion that these are interrelated seems to be somehow this sort of Western notion that you can separate and parse these out. He repeatedly talks about, and Dr. Bernice King is repeatedly reminding us that he talked about the triple evils, poverty, racism, and militarism are forms of violence that exist in a cycle. They are interrelated, they're all inclusive, and they stand as barriers to living in what Coretta King calls this beloved community. And the fact that you can talk about poor people, he says very specifically, Dr. King, there is nothing new about poverty. What is new, however, is that we now have the resources to get rid of it. The time has come for us to do an all-out war against poverty. The well-off and the secure have too often become indifferent and oblivious to the poverty and the deprivation in their midst. And ultimately, this is where the humanity part sort of surfaces. A great nation is a compassionate nation. No individual or nation can be great if it does not have the concern for the least of these. And I keep thinking about that relative to the work that Project Humanities does with our outreach to unsheltered folks. And this notion bothers me every time I walk, into a place, whether it's New York or Philadelphia, and I see people sleeping on the streets. And I wonder, why is it that we live in a society where people are so rich that we can send Teslas up into space, or so rich that we can buy a social media platform and essentially hold all that? And yet we, those who are doing some of this kind of economic justice work through our outreach, are being threatened to be ticketed or trespassed for giving out travel size shampoo and conditioner on the streets of City of Phoenix. So where is make that make sense for me? Like, why we are in a nation where there are people that are incredibly rich. And then I'm wondering if that, and I'm throwing a lot out here, I'm wondering if that, what scares people is that it's when you start talking about economic justice, homelessness, you talk about malnutrition, you talk about illiteracy, infant mortality, slums, unemployment, that somehow when you start talking about economic justice, it scares people because it sounds like socialism. it sounds like socialism. So maybe you and Ray can parse that out. Like, if it sounds like socialism, what part scares people about equity and in this umbrella of economic justice? Ray,
Well, I just kind of want to
any of that?
also kind of, yeah, so I did want to go back to like kind of going back to the basics of what we
Mhm.
mean by economic justice. And I think you kind of started that conversation where when we talk about economic justice, we talk about, why are we living in a nation that's, one of the greatest nations on earth, supposedly, and one of the wealthiest nations for sure. And we host some of the most of the billionaires in the world, but then we're still dealing with poverty issues. We still don't have nationalized healthcare. We still don't have the lowest of the low in our country not being cared for in a way that other countries have successfully done. And we're talking about socialism as well. And that's also one of the images that I believe Dr. King was kind of like, what also would make him unpopular was that if we branded him as a socialist, and there was a lot of that during the Red Scare, which was probably around like during this time. My dates are off, so I'm not sure, Dr. McKinney. Please
Well, you
correct
got it. You
me.
nailed it. That's it.
There was a lot of fear about communism and
Mhm.
Russia, and so like the big C became something that people were very afraid of, and along with that being socialism, and them being kind of conflated as the same ideologies as well. So when you talk about principles in which we bring up people who are at the lowest of our society and bringing them up to an equitable space, that scares a lot of people because, oh, that sounds like socialism. Oh, people don't just bring themselves up by their bootstraps. We have to take our tax dollars and help people who are less fortunate. So I think that kind of rubs people in the wrong way if we're constantly buying into this American dream situation where we're all kind of on the same playing field and we all start from the same level. And, if we're all at the same starting point in a race, then why aren't we all,
Right.
racing to the top basically, or making it to the end of the race even? But it's like some people start like 50 feet behind you, some people start a mile behind you, and how are you expecting them to make it to the end of a marathon, for example, if they're not able to physically or mentally, and maybe they haven't trained? So there's a lot of different factors when we talk about economic justice and how we make that happen. So economic justice, simply speaking, is making sure that people are paid fair wages. And how do we calculate fair wages? Well, there are different ways of doing that. And so like how can someone comfortably live in a society based off of what they earn from, and even the 40-hour work week is something that is actually pretty new, and that came out of different labor unions and labor movements. So it could even be less than 40 hours, like some other countries such as Portugal are instilling. So who says it has to be 40-hour work week? But in America, that's what we're familiar with. So we can look at that. And we can look at someone making, I think it's $7.65, which is still the national minimum wage. And can someone live comfortably off that in this country? Having food, having housing, do they have a healthy work-life balance, and making sure that all of these are put in place? And I think Cheryl was talking about, they pointed out earlier that, it's all about like having mobility and having access to, being able to have that good balance. And so I think when we talk about economic justice movements, they're all trying to make sure of that. So like when we talk about healthcare, healthcare is very costly in the US. If someone is making minimum wage or even a little bit above that, they're not going to be able to access healthcare, in a way that doesn't put them, it depends on their emergency, but it doesn't put them in, a huge amount of debt. Or we can even talk about if someone was in a bad living situation and they're only living paycheck to paycheck and they want to move out of it, are they able to do that to better their mental health? And if they're not making a good wage, they're not able to do that. So all of these things contribute to the livelihood of somebody and a good quality of life. And so when we talk about economic justice, we're talking about how can we make sure that everyone has a good quality of life. And I think that's kind of like the root of it. And, the principles of socialism and communism try to go that route, but the way that they were put into governments was just never really worked out in a really great way that we've seen infamously. So that's kind of what I want to frame economic justice as, is that it can go in a lot of different branches. But to me, essentially, it means that we want to make sure that everyone has a good quality of life, and we're living in a wealthy society. We should be able to have the capacity to do that.
Well, and you hit a
Amen.
whole lot of stuff there in a way that I'm reminded in the chat, people are wanting some distinction between equity and equality. And there's a famous drawing and illustration that I've used in some workshops where it's like people looking over a fence, and one is shorter, one is taller. And then people are saying, equity would be making sure that everybody gets to see over the fence. And some people, because they're shorter, may actually need a box to put under there so that they can be at the same height that somebody else is. And then somebody sort of challenged that image. You can Google that, but challenged that image and said, but that's not quite right either, because it assumes that if people are standing on a ground, and it is a ground like a playing field, baseball, I think they're watching, you can take the fence away, but the issue itself, and prop people up on boxes so that they can be at the same height. But that assumes that the ground itself is perfectly level. And there is no perfectly level ground. We can see that on any construction sites. They are always moving dirt around and digging things to make things level. So if you can't look at this systemically, then you're missing this when you're saying, oh, well, everybody doesn't need the same thing, but everybody may need something to be successful. Let's think about this in a classroom. People learn differently. That doesn't mean your special needs can't be equitable to people who need different ways of learning or different resources for learning. So that's my quick references to that illustration out there that has the people looking over the fences in the games. But you can add something a little more profound and substantial, Dr. McKinney. Equality.
No, I'm not. I'm taking a hit. I'm taking a hit on this one because I'm going
Okay.
after Ray. Ray kind of nailed that one. Ray kind of nailed that one down.
Okay.
I feel like we should go on to the next question.
Okay. So
But no, I would just say really quickly, right? And somebody did ask the question about the difference between equity and
Yes.
And equality. So I think you nailed that down. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. You got to look at the systemic stuff.
I just asked my wife does a lot of equity work, so I just asked her, and she basically said the same thing you did. So
yes.
So
and that
yes,
image,
so fact checking, you're perfect.
Thank you. And that image works beautifully, because for so many years we thought, oh, if we lift this person up and give them access, that's this. But I want to sort of transition that into...
Let me just jump in really quickly and say, King's answer to this question, right, is something called the Freedom Budget that he and A. Philip Randolph and a host of civil rights activists and organizations tried to get passed in the 1960s, right? And what he said about this was, we need an economic bill of rights. This would guarantee a job to all people who want to work and are able to work. It would also guarantee an income for all who are not able to work. Some people are too young, some are too old, some are physically disabled. Yet in order to live, they need income.
Yes.
Right. So the Freedom Budget, and you can access this online. You can pull it up online. I'll find the link and put it in the chat for everybody.
Right.
So it's 1967, and they're pushing, and King and Philip Randolph and a host of civil rights organizations are advocating for this Freedom Budget. Full employment to all who are willing to work. Assure decent and adequate wages to all who work. Decent living standard to those who cannot or should not work. Wipe out slums and ghettos and provide decent homes for Americans. It's got about 10 or 12 planks, right? And so again, this is where you see the equity work coming in, right? Just because you are unable to work does not mean you should starve to death.
Right.
Right?
Right.
We should live in a society. King was like, we should, and a whole bunch of others, we should live in a society that says, hey, you know what? We value humans.
Right.
We value all of the people who live here. Right? Because of our political commitments, because of our moral commitments, because of our religious commitments. If we in fact do that, says King, then we should make sure that we have the capacity and we have the resources to take care of people and to provide people the things that they need. We should do that work.
Right. Right.
right?
Well, and we need glasses. If Ayesha doesn't need glasses, then we don't need to give Ayesha a pair of glasses. Ayesha's seeing fine without his glasses. So there are all kinds of ways in which that needs to be teased out. You know what this also reminded me of, I think it was mentioned, Ray, you mentioned this about this sort of mythical bootstrap theory, because when you start about people having a good quality of life, people want to sort of slide in that sort of very annoying, oh, well, I did it, so you should be able to do it. You know, and you mentioned this before, Ray, that people didn't start in the same place. And when I do that sort of feared, privilege walk, there are people behind you, there are also people in front of you. But you have to at least acknowledge that this is not about you individually. This is about what we were born into. So we have to use that P word, the privilege word. So let's talk about that whole myth of the bootstrap theory and this meritocracy, that those who are making the most is because they have worked the hardest. And Dr. King certainly wouldn't subscribe to that. So tell me about that meritocracy. What is that that's inherently connected to economic disparities and economic justice? Meritocracy.
It's really interesting because I've been listening to a podcast lately called Good Bad Billionaires, and it's by the BBC. And the two hosts kind of, they look at a billionaire every single week, and they look at their life story, where they started from, how did they get to the top? Did they have to run people over? Did they, to what extent did they ever, how did they get their money, into how much evil did they have to get that much money? Because when we think about billions and billionaires, and when I think about meritocracy, I really think about billionaires, because is there any way that people can possibly work infinitely much harder to become, a Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk? I don't think Elon Musk works that much harder than the rest of us in order to be able to reach billions. And when we talk about billions, and this was an English reference, they were talking about, well, I don't remember, the Battle of Hastings, and you could get $1 million every single year since then, and you still wouldn't be a billionaire right now. And that's how much $1 billion dollars are. So, and when you think about someone who has $100 billion, like, that's just mind blowing. And you're like, since 1,000 years ago, you could be getting, well, less than 1,000 years ago, 900 years ago, you'd be getting $1 million every day. You still wouldn't get there. So I don't think Elon Musk, I don't think Jeff Bezos is working that infinitely that much harder. So when we talk about meritocracy and we talk about equity and economic justice, like, we really have to examine these systems that allow someone to amass that much wealth as well. So I kind of want to bring up that topic.
Yeah. Well, and with the bootstraps, I'm always saying things like, well, first of all, I have some boots, but they don't have straps on them. And you have to have certain kinds of appendages to pull these up, or certain kinds of instruments to pull them up. And it assumes that people have boots to begin with. So there are all these kinds of layers that sort of undermine this and move away from this kind of victim blaming, or, I worked hard, so you should do that too. Um, so the meritocracy thing, it's sort of like, if we want to bring in kind of the Harvard situation, everybody in Harvard got there because they deserved that. Every president who served as president got there because they deserved it and they worked hard. And then we find that, the most recent president was sort of ousted, one might argue, as a DEI who wasn't qualified. So this notion of meritocracy has always been linked to a certain kind of bias and privilege, and we have to look at that intersectionally. It is not coincidental that the people that you just named as billionaires are mostly white men. It's not coincidental that most of the people who are incarcerated now are not mostly white men. So there's a way that we have to look at this as not about personal responsibility and not about victim blaming, about something systemic, and that is not about victimhood. Now, I want to shift, because people were asking if that works. I want to ask if we can talk a little bit about where Dr. King outlines very specifically, Dr. McKinney, this is for you. Where does he outline these economic practices or these economic justice practices? Because people are going to say, well, I don't actually see that. And y'all are kind of like bringing in this radical part that has disrupted my sort of safe Dr. King. Where do we find that? and I said earlier, I can't think of a place where we don't find it, but let's give some people some direction in terms of where you can find King talking specifically about economic justice and what he is saying.
Sure. Well, again, that I just put the document in the chat, right?
Okay.
The freedom budget.
Okay, the
Right?
freedom budget.
He's
Yes.
like, we need a guaranteed, and it doesn't get much more explicit than that, right?
Right.
Martin King says we need to provide resources for every American so that they can flourish. Full
Okay.
stop. Right? There it is.
Right.
So, game over, right?
Right.
So there's that. So, I would point people there. I would point
Right.
people to all of his books. He talks about this in all of his books, but in particular, he talks about this in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, right? He wrote it in 1967. It's published posthumously after after he is assassinated. But he's got some very clear, outlines there, again, in terms of what needs to happen. Again, we have to remember, right? Economic inequality is a function of segregation.
Right. I love
right. That is one of the primary byproducts of segregation. Right. So, and this is the other thing that we've done when we take King out of his context and when we try to right, steer away from what segregation actually was, what segregation actually is, right, and the ways in which it and all of the deleterious effects of segregation, then we wind up having these sorts of conversations, right, around, well, why do we need economic justice? Right. Well, because, right, because for the first 70%, before the first 70% of the history of the country, it was illegal for Black people to read. Right, you could be murdered for reading.
Right.
From 1619 up to 1865. And then from 1865 to 1965, access to education was severely limited to Black folk. Right. So there's that. Right. Housing options. Right. The GI Bill that's passed in the 1940s. No, Black folks don't have access to that. Black folks don't have access to FDR's FDR's New Deal program, right? Particularly the economic benefits of that program, unemployment insurance and unemployment assistance. There's a carve out to accommodate the segregationist South. So you can get unemployment insurance unless you are a domestic or a farm laborer. Who are the domestics and farm laborers in the American South? Black people. Right? So there are all of these structural carve-outs designed specifically to leave Black people out of the bounty of economic growth and opportunity. Right? I didn't make that up. I'm not trying to make people feel bad because I believe in critical race theory. This is just what happened. Right? All of the days end in Y. Gravity works. Viola Davis is a brilliant actress. These are all facts. These are all things that are true. Yes. Right? So systemic racism structures our society in a way that many of the benefits, economic benefits of citizenship, many of the economic benefits of being an American are segregated so that non-white Americans have less access to those resources. Right. So, and there's just no way around that. Right. So then what is the answer to that? What King and others are saying in the 1950s and 60s is, well, we need to restructure the system so that people can, in fact, gain access to these resources so that they can live a fully functioning human life. Right. So in addition to the structural barriers of segregation, in addition to making it so that Black folk can attend colleges in the American South, in addition to providing access to health care, in addition to providing access to housing and employment, in addition to all of these things, we need to make fundamental structural changes in our economic system and in our political system. Those two things are linked. Right? So that, again, we can create a nation in which everyone can thrive. Now, the other thing I would say really quickly, right, is that King, you will notice in the freedom budget, King is not advocating for a guaranteed income just for Black people. right? He is not saying, oh, hey, Black
Right.
people need to get a guaranteed income from the federal government. He says every American, every person who lives in this country should gain access to that,
Right.
because nobody should go hungry, nobody should go sick,
Right.
nobody should go unhoused. Right? So that's the other thing that I think is really important for us to remember in this moment, is that Martin King is advocating for an economic platform that benefits todo el mundo, that benefits everybody. Everybody gets to benefit from this, because ultimately everybody is harmed by systems that pick winners and losers. Right? We are all being harmed by a system that doles out healthcare to people who have access to jobs.
See, now
right? We're all being harmed by a system that makes it increasingly harder for people to gain access to education, for people to gain access to housing, for people to gain access to healthcare, so on and so forth. We all take a hit for that. And so again, this expansive system, this expansive idea being promoted by King and Randolph, the Black Panthers, quite frankly, right? A whole host of folks of progressive forces in American society in the 50s and 60s. This was an expansive vision that was literally designed to lift all boats.
Right. But even that, though, is more threatening, though, because then you're sort of moving beyond and within race to bring more people together, so that this becomes a class movement and not something that is just racially based. And that is even more dangerous than trying to keep people segregated, is bringing people together.
Well, this is the danger of, and this is the danger of the radical possibility of something like the Poor People's Campaign,
That's
right?
yes.
That King crafts in 1967, that tragically he does not live to see, right? But the object of the game is to bring 3,000 to 5,000 poor people. He does not say Black poor people.
Right, poor people
From across the country,
yes,
up into Washington, D.C., into Washington Mall, and to stay there until Congress passes some legislation designed to address poverty. Again, not poverty just for Black people,
right,
but for poverty all across the country, right? Because again, this was something that was politically untenable. King found to be politically untenable, but also, if we look at his words, morally untenable. The three great evils: racism, militarism, poverty. Evils.
Right.
He's very intentional about the things. King is always very intentional about the things that he calls evil. Right? You'll notice he doesn't call people evil.
Right.
Some people he does, right? He talks about evil actions.
Yes.
Right? Evil activities, evil intent. Right? But these are the three great evils.
Yes.
There are no greater evils than these three things that he names. Right? And so poverty is one of the evils.
Right.
It's one of the things that we have to address directly. We have to confront head on. And if we don't, we do so. Our failure to do so is at our peril.
Well, and it's interesting too, as a preacher, he's calling this, but he calls it out every time he gets an opportunity. So if you want to find that, look at his Nobel lecture address in 1964. And he's saying, I take this award, but at the same time, people are being bombed in Birmingham and people are going hungry. And he says the second evil, and this is what he says in that speech, the second evil which plagues the modern world is that of poverty. Like a monstrous octopus, it projects its nagging tentacles in lands and villages all over the world. Almost 2/3 of the peoples of the world go to bed hungry at night. That is not about the content of our character. Nobody should go to bed hungry at night. They are undernourished, ill-housed, and shabbily clad. Many of them have no houses or beds to sleep in. Their only beds are the sidewalks of the cities and the dusty roads of the villages. And most of these poverty-stricken children have never seen a physician or a dentist. So he's talking about health care. He's talking about affordable housing. He's talking about a living wage, and nothing about who deserves more than other because they worked hard. And, there's nothing, and this is the part that he really sort of hits at when he says, there is nothing new in that same speech. There's nothing new about poverty. What is new, however, is that we have the resources to get rid of it. So Ray, I'm going to transition into kind of your on the ground work of what you have done in that arena of you outlined a little bit of it, but I want to give you an opportunity to sort of tell us when people are saying, well, okay, we've established what the problem is in a broad sense. What are we supposed to do about it? Because it's too big. I can't do anything about it. So tell us how and why you got involved in this sort of economic justice work and how people can, not necessarily how they can get involved, but what your lived experience has taught you about why this is necessary work.
Yeah, so I'll go back and reference my upbringing in the Catholic Church when I did do all the mission trips, and I was kind of like taught to, be mindful of the poor, because these are very like basic Christian principles, which funnily enough, we're supposedly supposed to be a Christian nation, but yet we base our merits, we're on a meritocracy as well. So that's kind of really interesting that there's a divergence there. And I feel like a lot of what, as Dr. King being a reverend, his life and legacy, I think it's rooted in those Christian values, which I just think is really interesting when we look at today. And our country, which is supposedly rooted on Christian values, is not taking this more seriously. But it did begin like in the church, and when I was, mindful of always being mindful of people who had less privilege than me. And I think that kind of rang into my college days when I made the transition from being a really religious Catholic person to being someone involved in social justice issues. So I had joined a group called United Students Against Sweatshops. And that was a group that was kind of, loosely based in bettering the working conditions of those who are in factories abroad. So, famously citing the Bangladesh Raza Plaza collapse. I think that had happened more recently in like 2009 at the time. And so that was a building where a whole bunch of people had died because there were not safe working conditions. And so kind of basing on like the other of like, oh, people in this country are suffering because of the clothing that we're buying. So part of our campaigns were about that, but also the other part of this group, that was harnessing student and worker power, was that we were focusing on labor movements that were happening locally. And so a lot of the people in the group when I had joined, they were, older, they were like seniors and juniors, and I was a freshman. They were involved in different groups, Unite Here, was it probably AFSCME as well, different unions, and they were working with unions. And one of the first protests I ever went to was actually organizing the Tempe Mission Palms Hotel with the workers there. And so I know I started to hear the stories of people who were the cleaning crew, and they were, just given a huge amount of work, and then they were not being paid well as on top of that. So we got involved in a lot of these groups. And so even being involved in that protest kind of changed my perspective of what it actually means to affect change. And so through those people, through that group, I met someone from Lucha. And so Lucha was really big into organizing for the Fight for 15 movement in Arizona. So we organized a big, I guess, it was a protest, I think back in 2015, 2016, for the Prop 206, which raised the minimum wage in Arizona. So I was really involved in organizing for that campaign, knocking on doors, everything. And I think there's a multitude of other things that I did. I was always busy, but I think being involved in those groups and being involved in organizing really taught me that and especially when Prop 206 passed and the minimum wage in Arizona, I think it was the federal minimum wage. I'm not sure what it was, but it jumped to 850. No, it was 850, and then it jumped to 1250, which it is now, I believe. That it saw that I was able to affect change as an individual when I join a group of other people, and that student and worker power as a collective is very powerful, but nobody can do it by themselves. And I think that's what I really learned about being involved in grassroots organizing, and organizing for economic justice movements, because when I was an organizer for the Texas State Employees Union, we were tiny, but we were mighty. So in Texas, our union was actually not allowed to actually negotiate contracts. So we were basically a lobbying organization because that's all we were allowed to do. So we were able to propose bills to raise the minimum, not raise the minimum wage, but to raise the wages of Texas state employees and to give more to the pension of those who had worked for the state of Texas. But even then, as a lobbying group, we needed the numbers. And I think any union really functions that way, where you need to have an overwhelming majority of people to vote for a union. So I think that's what Starbucks is doing right now. And that's why we were seeing more Starbucks unions pop up, because people are collectively organizing. And so you need that people power. Every single person counts, every single person that I got to join the union that, was giving their $25 a month in dues, which I know is a lot. I mean, back then it paid for 2 streaming accounts, but now it probably only covers 1. But I think that that's the most important thing when someone thinks about, well, what can I really do? Does like protesting in the streets really help? Does signing a petition really do anything? Because I'm just one person and they don't really need me to do anything. And I think as someone who has come from an organizing background, I would say that every single person counts. That, every single person that can show up to a protest, every single person that can join their union, every single person that can, show up to a meeting, even though it's just like a film screening of, like some pro-union movie. I forgot the name of it, but it's a pretty famous one. But yeah, and I think that that says a lot. And so kind of that's how I got involved in it. And that's why I'm still a very big advocate of people being involved in movements, just because I see that it's the only way that things are going to happen, especially in the US, because we realize that our government is not actually out here to help people who are they're not gonna do it out of their own will. Our government is not just gonna say, oh yeah, now everyone can have healthcare without a big fight. So I think that's something that I took away from my experience.
You also mentioned in the office that that's also exhausting work, and people burn out very quickly because it seems like, and I guess we could say this about any kind of justice work. I mean, the question I asked at the top of this was, well, what do we talk about when we talk about economic justice? Well, certainly economic justice is akin to all environmental justice and all these other justice dimensions of that, but it can be exhausting when it seems like this is just moving at a snail's pace, or you're continually running up against things. So that pales in comparison to the life that Dr. King was leading, trying to bring people together. And I remember his daughter, Dr. Bernice A. King, when she was our speaker 10 years ago, for our 10th year anniversary, said, and you said this too, Dr. McKinney, her dad was the most hated man in the country at the time that he was assassinated, but yet he was assassinated trying to do what kind of work? So I'm tossing this into your Memphis space now. Why was he in Memphis? Dr. McKinney?
Well, yeah, so he's in Memphis for the sanitation workers strike, right?
Right.
He's in Memphis to help to give aid and comfort to a movement for, wait for it, economic justice, right?
Everywhere.
Yeah, right. So,
It's everywhere.
he's moved, the movement had started before and he's invited in to a
Yes.
movement that had been started by, by brothers in the union here after the death of 2 sanitation workers
Right.
who died in the back of a malfunctioning sanitation truck. So he's here to address issues of economic injustice, right? He breaks off from planning the Poor People's March to come to Memphis.
Right.
First initially in March and then in April. And so the whole opposite of the game for him to be here, right, was to engage in this work of economic justice. The opposite of the game for the Poor People's Campaign was to engage in the work of economic justice on a national scale, on a national level, right? So his arriving in Memphis in 1968 was simply an extension of that work. And the other thing that we should point out, I would like to point out really quickly, right, is that one of the things we tend to do when we think about King and economics is we say things like, oh, he's not concerned about economics until the last few years of his life. And that's not quite right. Right? I think a better way to say that is he's always concerned about economics, but his analysis becomes more focused. His analysis becomes sharper, and he has an understanding of, and he talks about this as well in 1967, 68, right? Where he says, I thought we could sort of tweak the system around the edges and that we would be okay, right? But I was wrong about that, he says. What I understand now is that we've got to make some significant structural changes in order to get where we need to go. Right. So, so he's concerned about economic inequality in 1955 in the Montgomery bus boycott. He's concerned about economic inequality in the late 1950s, early 1960s. Right. But he's under the mistaken impression that, we can tweak a few things and, and once we get rid of legal segregation and get the Voting Rights Act and tweak a few other things, then we're fine. Right. But he understands, but by the time we get to 1966, 1967, 1968, he understands and is more able to forcefully articulate, right, this larger, broader, more focused critique and analysis of American economic dynamics and what needs to happen in order to transform those dynamics.
Well, I want to highlight a couple of things that sort of, I think, one of the challenges that you gave us, Dr. McKinney, is to go revisit what he actually said. Go revisit what he said, because he said it in so many places. And I'm thinking of the "I Have a Dream" speech, which people zip to the last part. That whole speech is about the rhetoric of economics, though. It's about a promissory note and going to a bank that is morally corrupt or bankrupt and saying, I know that you have some promises there that you can make good on. And I always go back. That's the first part, which is a significant part of that whole "I Have a Dream" speech. But he also talks about that in The Other America. I mean, that whole thing is about land of opportunity and about poverty, and some people get this and some people get that. That is a radical speech. But I also want to draw attention, and maybe you can address this too, that he doesn't sort of talk about this economic injustice without talking about responsibility that comes with that. And I'm thinking particularly of the drum major instinct. Can you elaborate on what might be perceived as a sort of, not sort of talking about economic justice as though it's simple, but also adding responsibility to what that means relative to economics in that the drum major instinct?
Sure. Well, the drum major instinct and a host of his other writings, right? Again, in these last few years, he's really clear about, look, in for a penny, in for a pound. Right? Here are the things that need to happen, and here are the people who need to be responsible for these things. Right? So he's putting them on the hook. Right. In some really explicit ways with regard to, the expenditure of resources, the allocation of funds. For the purposes of sustainable, sustainable existence for folks. So he's doing that work in the drum major instinct. Again, he's doing that work in Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. He's doing that work in so many places and spaces, right, with regard to the role of the federal government, with regard to the ways in which, he's got a great piece in Where Do We Go From Here? He was like, look, what we're getting ready to do right now, he's like, we're getting ready to lose some allies right now. Right. Because now it's the hard work. Right. This is a speech he gives in Atlanta in 1967, where he says, yeah, this is the part where we lose allies. He said, it didn't cost the federal government a dime to get rid of segregation. It doesn't cost a dime to enforce, to pass the Voting Rights Act. Right. But now that we're asking for economic justice, now that we're asking for these structural changes, a bunch of our allies, a bunch of the folks who were like, yay, we're going to see a bunch of them, they're going to fall away now.
Right. Well, it's also interesting that so much of even getting at the King holiday was also wrapped in economics. And I'm thinking that's, at least with Juneteenth, people kept saying, oh, we can't afford another holiday. And it's interesting to me that in our own sort of local state history, that the holiday only came to be when there was this threat of some kind of taking economics and the Super Bowl away from Arizona. And people decided, oh no, let's have this holiday. And that was in the 90s. So I want to say early 90s. Well, let's see. The holiday, it says that Congress had established this in 83, and that in Arizona there had been such resistance from Governor Mitchum that the Super Bowl was going to be threatened. The NFL stripped Phoenix of its host of the 1993 Super Bowl and gave the hosting to Los Angeles. And then Arizona was tentatively awarded the Super Bowl with the condition that the state passes a referendum on making the MLK, and it was approved in 1992. So this is still relatively fresh, and notice how it's connected to economics in a very, very specific way. So this notion of trying to talk about King only through the limited lens of race sort of reduces and takes away this fact that we have to talk about this intersectionally. We have to talk about this in a way that economics and race are inherently connected, that class and economics. I want to give time to sort of observe the chat. We've had people from our team looking at the chat. Are there some specific ideas that we want to address so that we acknowledge the people in our virtual pews that you have seen, Dr. McKinney or Ayush or Christine or anybody else on our team? Has there been an idea that we want to address before we sort of move toward the sort of closing moments of this? So any ideas that have come out in the chat that we need to address or want to address? Yes, King's anti-war. Those were sort of one of the three evils too was militarism. You want to talk about that, Dr. McKinney?
Sure. I'm just putting in a quote from King that's addressing this other point.
Well, and just so that people know, we put a lot of stuff in the chat. We've made references to things, but one of our practices is to make sure that those who registered, not just those who attended, will also get a follow-up resource list. So you don't have to frantically take pictures of the chat because the chat disappears once we close, but we will comb through those chat comments and then pull out these references that we've made so that you can have something to follow up on. Okay. Yes. So you want to talk a little bit about the anti-war? We know that he was opposed to the Vietnam War and didn't make a secret of that.
Right. So there's a couple of things that are I think really interesting about King's position on Vietnam. Right. There's a couple of historical figures that we should mention here who are ahead of him with regard to the position on Vietnam. The first one we should mention is Coretta Scott King.
Yes.
Right? Who is a badass in her own right, right? She's getting more of her flowers these days in terms of the work that she was putting in. So she is an active and explicit pacifist, right? And she had been a pacifist when she first meets King, right, in Boston in the 1950s. So she's in front of him on this. And so she had been pushing her husband to take a stand on Vietnam, right, which he eventually does in 1967. Mm-hmm. The other national figure that I think we should mention here is Malcolm X, mm-hmm. right? Malcolm is also a critic of the Vietnam War. And he points and he triangulates his criticism in a very particular sort of way. He was like, let me get this straight. We're supposed to be nonviolent here, right, when we fight for our rights, but we're supposed to go and blow up Vietnamese people. Mm-hmm. Which one is it?
Right.
And right. You can't have it both. You can't have it both ways. So this is a stinging rebuke of King's position on nonviolence, right? Particularly while King doesn't have anything to say about Vietnam and the escalation of Vietnam, and he's torn about that. Mm-hmm. Can I talk about Vietnam and still be an effective and powerful advocate for civil rights? He finally arrives at that conclusion that, yes, I can, and I have a moral obligation to do so. right? So on April 4th, 1967, he gives his famous speech, Riverside Church, where he comes out against the Vietnam War, right? And he says, I can't reconcile these things. I can't square this circle. And I can't get over the fact, right, that right now, the greatest purveyor of violence on the planet today is my own government.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody is a purveyor as a more pervasive purveyor of violence than the American than the American government. That was true in 1967. It's true now, right? So so King comes out very, very, very powerfully against the war. And again, this is another one of the reasons that drives down his popularity, that drives his numbers down. Mm-hmm. Right? The Washington Post comes out the next day and says, "What on earth is Dr. King thinking?" Right? His own allies come out against him, right? Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young and the National Urban League, Roy Wilkins and a whole bunch of other folks say, Martin, this is wrong. You don't have any business talking about this. This is outside of your purview, so on and so forth. But he was like, no, actually, right? I have a moral framework, mm-hmm. and I can't ignore, right, this conflict taking place in Southeastern, in the Southeast Asia. I can't ignore that anymore. So I have a moral obligation to speak out against this war. Because if I don't, I am politically and morally inconsistent. I'm running around the country talking about nonviolence, running around the country talking about turn the other cheek, satyagraha, right, so on and so forth, but don't have anything to say about war. Mm-hmm. I can't do it anymore. Right. So April 4th, 1967, the Riverside speech, and it's online. Everyone should check it out. And he's making some really specific distinctions here too, with regard to, right, you've got a black soul, a black citizen and a white citizen, they're segregated in American life in some really particular ways, but they're both eligible for death. Mm-hmm. Right. Once they get drafted. He talks about the inequality with regard to the draft. Again, the structural racism woven into something like a draft, for instance, i.e., if you are in college, you can get a deferment, right? Black folk and brown folk and poor white folk, lower rates of college of college attendance. So then they're higher rates. So then overrepresented in the people who are being drafted. Mm-hmm. Which then translates into overrepresentation of the people who were being killed in Vietnam, right? So on and so forth. So he's bringing all of that into that speech as well. So, I mean, it's a very powerful speech. And also, again, this isn't the King that a whole bunch of folks aren't too fond of talking about.
Yeah. Well, because
right? We're not too fond of talking about the King who says no to war.
See?
Right?
But this is the part that makes people uncomfortable, though. This is the part, which is why Dr. King's books about Dr. King are being banned in these elementary schools. Books about Rosa Parks, books about Ruby Bridges are being banned because it makes people feel bad. I'm saying this is so relevant to what it is we're talking about relative to King's legacy and his life speaking to right now. And I appreciate what you talked about relative to Coretta Scott King. And I think that was one of the things that Dr. Bernice King, the daughter, was so excited by, is that so much of what people know doesn't reflect always the central role that her mother played in that. Even with the center itself, the beloved community, I quoted earlier something that came from Coretta Scott King. And so looking at that relationship, looking at the ways in which King's ideas did evolve, I'm always going back, and I see Doug mention the Other America. If you do nothing else, please read The Other America or listen to it on YouTube, where he does say, yeah, I'm talking about nonviolence as a potent weapon for oppressed people, but at the same time, it's necessary for me to condemn all the other, riotous things that are happening. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor, there's the class again, that the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years, and it's failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not met. And it fails to hear, and this is where that quote comes from, that large segments of white society are more concerned, and we could say white society, rich society, people who are well off, because he makes those distinctions, are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity. Than about justice and humanity. In our conversation, we frame that around these Humanity 101 principles. We cannot talk about social justice and racial justice and environmental justice and all these other areas of justice without looking at what is being denied in terms of people's humanity. And economic justice is there. Name one thing where economic justice is not present. Can anybody do that? Name one place where economics is not somehow figured into those experiences. I can't think of it. It can't be education. It can't be healthcare. I kept thinking of this relative to the pandemic, that we are seeing more people who are unsheltered in our outreach than we did before. And people kept saying, well, you know, we're in this boat together. People kept saying, no, we're not. There are people who were on the front lines who didn't have the option of ordering things and having it delivered, or couldn't. For example, if you're an hourly worker, you can't just stay at home because then you wouldn't be paid. So you would go in sick, and people would say so casually, oh, if you're not feeling well, just stay at home. Well, if I stay at home, I'm not getting paid. Do you see what I'm saying? There's so much privilege that comes in that. And I have to say that we've all been complicit in not committing ourselves to disrupting some of those systems. I mean, I watch it institutionally, both locally and afar, and realize that the fight is so overwhelming that sometimes it's easier for people to just say, well, there's nothing I can do. And I say this relative to the notion of justice in and of itself. You know, we don't know when it will happen, but we do know that we have to keep fighting until we see something that is more just than it was. And that to me seems to be the challenge now. People have, how many of you went to a march today? I know you didn't go anyplace if you were in Memphis because y'all were snowed down. But if you went to a march or you did service, this is why we come together on the evening of the MLK holiday to make education part of that piece as well. There is nothing wrong with a day of service. There is nothing wrong with picking up trash. We did it all weekend with supporting our unsheltered clients with simple things, toothpaste, deodorant, shoes, gently used shoes, backpacks. We're doing a fundraiser for soap now. These are basic necessities that people need for human dignity. We're not necessarily giving anybody a job. We're not teaching them how to do a resume. We are trying to extend some kindness, some compassion, some respect, and offer people who are denied so little. And economics is one of those ways. The poorer you are, when we talk about all lives matter, poor people's lives don't matter. We know that. So I want us to sort of reframe, you know, this annual Day of King celebration to also be about educating ourselves and also doing more. So Ray, you've been on the grounds. Do you have any recommendations of what people might do? I know you mentioned that earlier, and I know you're not prescribing, but you saw things that could work, and you could also make both direct people both locally and perhaps to larger issues. You mentioned a couple of organizations doing this work.
Yeah, I would say my first recommendation is if anyone approaches you to join a union, just join it. If you care about economic justice at all. I mean, there's even like if someone at your workplace is talking about it, and I know I say that so casually. I know that
Right.
there are consequences to joining a union sometimes
Right.
if you're in a very anti-union company. But like I said, there is strength in numbers. So I would say that, you know, if the person next to you doesn't join and you don't join and the person next to that person next to you doesn't join, then you're not going to get anywhere. And this comes from having a little bit of bravery. So I know I say that so casually, but I would say that was my first recommendation, but I also say that as someone who is a union organizer for a time. So, and I think, yes, Rachel also says get involved in mutual aid. I think that's a really
Yes.
great way to get involved with that. Join your local Buy Nothing group.
Mhm.
And these are like very simple ways so you don't like constantly contribute to big corporations that are making millions of profits off of, you know, slave labor wages and also unsafe working conditions, and also it's sustainable as well. Different groups you can get involved in right now, like we were talking about, is really exhausting to be in this work. So I have taken a little bit of a break from it as well, but I can put some recommendations of local organizations that are doing some good work. I know like Black Phoenix Organizing Collective is a group that we've worked with at Project Humanities, and they do a lot of mutual aid work. They do a lot of organizing work. And Lucha, again, is another organization that I used to work with and for a time. A lot of different, get involved in your community. I would just say go out and get involved. And if you're someone that isn't able to do that, whether it's physically or mentally, sometimes there are conversations where people say, oh, social media activism doesn't do anything, but I think it's really where people were getting a lot of their information these days. So I think that resharing information that you think is good to know, and that maybe other people in your networks may not know, I think sharing information is also really good about that. Highlighting awareness of other organizations once you become aware of them, so people can get involved. And even if you're not in a position to give to others financially or with your time or with your presence, then you can still have other people in your network be aware of that. And so, yeah, I will put them in the resources spreadsheet that we'll be sending out in a couple of days. If anyone has any recommendations for specific ones, you can put it in the chat, and I'll make sure to put them in that email so everyone can get access to it. But yeah, that's some of the things off the top of it. There's so many ways. There's so many ways to get, being an ally in boycotts. So if Starbucks workers are telling you don't go to Starbucks, don't go to Starbucks, just stuff like that. Especially if it's, a Starbucks that is trying to get a union and, organize to get a contract there, just different things like that, that we can, vote with our dollar as well, is really what if you can't do anything, vote with your dollar is what I try to say.
Well, and I appreciate the fact that this is not a prescription of what you have to do. And you've also got to sort of center how you're measuring the success of your work. But this is done for anybody that's doing the justice work. And this is not about virtue signaling. This is about saying there is a role for you if you're committed to doing this work. Dr. McKinney, do you have any suggestions about what people might be engaged in, or reminding people what they're already engaged in that can make an impact?
What Ray said.
Okay, what Ray said. Well, and I don't want to assume that people out there aren't already doing the work. So
yeah, right. I mean, literally, this is how the work begins, right? SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is pound for pound the most progressive and impactful sort of small scale civil rights organization in throughout the 1960s, right? I mean, they're outsized influence. What do? They go to houses and knock on doors and ask people to join them. Right. So, so there's a whole bunch of organizations in your town, wherever y'all are, for the 50 folks, for the 50 participants who are still on this call. It's a whole bunch of organizations out here doing really good work. Go find them.
Well, and
spend time and break bread with them. And also those community-based organizations, write a check. Right? Hit them up on Cash App, hit them up on Venmo. So maybe I'm not going to be out here engaged in this action. Y'all need money.
Right.
Where do I send it? Do that too.
And pay attention to what's happening, because there's not a decision that's made politically and socially that is not somehow connected to economic justice. I'm thinking of the Supreme Court decision to ban abortion. That is about economic justice. Who can afford to go to get to places where abortion is healthcare and is legal? Denying race as something to get into college, that is connected to economic justice. So again, I challenge us to think about something that is not connected to economic justice. I want to sort of thank Ray and Dr. McKinney again for me, which an educational experience. It's always wonderful to have a conversation that is not necessarily a lecture. I want to end with a commentary by African-American scholar, author, and another historian known for his analysis of U.S. race relations. And his commentary is called "The Real Meaning of the King Holiday." Now, I don't think he necessarily speaks for everybody, but it certainly leaves me some food for thought when he says the crucial point here and elsewhere is that this is not a holiday for rest and frivolity and play. This is a day for study, struggle, and preparation for the victory to come. It is a day set aside for measuring ourselves and America against the terrible yardstick of King's hope. If we loved him, we will use this time to mobilize against the evils he identified so vigorously, the evils of racism, the evils of militarism, the evils of poverty. It is on this deep level and in the context of personal responsibilities that the King holiday assumes its true purpose. For it is not enough to celebrate King, it is necessary also to vindicate him by letting his light shine in our own actions and lives. And on that, I want to thank everybody who stayed, those who came. Dr. McKinney, it's always good to have you in a conversation. I sit at your feet learning. I sit at the feet of Ray learning and challenging. And Ray, you're still doing that work. When we're trying to decide where we're going to get some collateral, you're saying, okay, let's not go with this organization, let's go with this organization. So people do work in different ways, but somebody is watching. So I thank you all. Stay tuned, and let's see what we are doing now tomorrow that we weren't doing last year around the King holiday. Again, the last slide, Christine. I want to remind you that Project Humanities, this is our first event of the spring 24. And we have other programs coming up. Many of them are in person, so we appreciate the opportunity to connect with our former staff member, Rachel, who is out doing great doctoral work. But we also have feedback forms, so please, please, please give us your feedback, the good and the honest. But we also hope that if you appreciated something about this program, that you'll tune in to our other programs through social media and also by telling people about the work that we're doing. We mentioned at the top of this the Humanity 101 pledge here. Those principles of compassion, empathy, forgiveness, integrity, kindness, respect, self-reflection. These are not faith-based, but rather faith in humanity. And to make it easy for you, there's a QR code that you can use to take that pledge. We should be able to pledge these things, not just in terms of organizations, but also in terms of our personal commitment. And stay tuned, as I mentioned earlier, for the resource email that will follow up with the Zoom recording and other resources. And please, if other ideas come up that we didn't mention, please pass those on so that we could share those with those who have an interest in building and being better. I thank you all and wish you a very happy and healthy, prosperous 2024. Thank you very much.